New updates from the war in the Middle East as Israel launched a series of airstrikes targeting Hezbollah infrastructure in southern Lebanon yesterday, killing at least 2 fighters and at least 7 civilians. The strikes were in response to an attack by Hezbollah forces against Israel, resulting in the death of 1 Israeli soldier and the wounding of 7 others. The exchange of missiles comes as countries across the world begin to express unease towards Israel's actions in Gaza. The parliamentary secretary to Canada's foreign affairs minister said in a leaked audio from a phone call with a constituent that the suspension of the UN RWA was, quote, political and wrong, and admits that Israel is, quote, probably committing genocide. Meanwhile, the prime ministers of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand released a joint statement on a potential military operation in Rafah, Gaza. From the statement, a military operation into Rafah would be catastrophic. About 1.5 million Palestinians are taking refuge in the area, including many of our citizens and their families. With the humanitarian situation in Gaza already dire, the impacts on Palestinian civilians from an expanded military operation would be devastating. We urge the Israeli government not to go down that path. There is simply nowhere else for civilians to go. The statement comes on the heels of a military operation at Nasser Hospital in Gaza that Israeli forces claimed was a staging ground for Hamas terror operations and holding hostages. Here's statements from IDF forces yesterday.
We have credible intelligence from a number of sources, including from released hostages, indicating that Hamas held hostages at the Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, and that there may be bodies of our hostages in the Nasser Hospital facility, as was proven with the Shifa Hospital, Rantisi Hospital, El Amal Hospital, and many other hospitals across Gaza. Hamas systematically uses hospitals as terror hubs. According to intelligence assessments and information we gathered on the ground, over 85% of major medical facilities in Gaza have been used by Hamas for terror operations.
Now, there have been attacks in Khan Yunis, which was originally designated as an area that would be safe. The UN RWA operates schools there. Schools have been turned into places for people to shelter. There were 1,800 people sheltering in a school that was shot at repeatedly by Israeli forces on January 25th and 27th, and then on February 7th. They divided the women and the men in the school. 800 men complied. They were all put in a room, stripped from their clothes. 15 of them were taken away while they were completely naked, including 1 UN social worker. The statements from the United States that the UN RWA is somehow complicit in what Hamas is doing because Hamas allegedly has gotten some supplies is ridiculous, especially when you consider how they're operating in the places that were formerly designated safe by the IDF, and now they're beginning ground operations on a place that is smaller than some airports, where 1.5 million people are. It is smaller than Heathrow Airport in London. So it's really an insane situation that the United States is currently considering giving more aid to Israel. Amiss, President Biden has also signed, this agreement, that his own order that the United States will not give weapons to human rights violators, and that's been seen to happen in Gaza time and again.
I think the UNRWA problem is more than just that they could potentially be providing indirect support to Hamas, but the fact that there were 10 confirmed employees who actively participated in the October 7th attacks. Now, that is a small percentage of the overall employees, but we also see, according to intelligence, that about half of them either have family members who are directly involved in terrorism, and 1,200 UNRWA employees are either Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad operatives. And so I think it makes sense to pause aid to them until they can root out some of these problems, considering the level of terrorist sympathizers that are working in this so-called aid organization. We also see that Biden has been pushing forward the idea of a two-state solution and specifically recognizing a Palestinian state, which is a bit of a stronger statement than we've seen from him previously. He's obviously responding to pressure from the base of the Democratic Party and especially Arab American groups to be less pro-Israel and to provide more support for Palestine. I guess just my question for you is, if Biden were to offer a recognition of the Palestinian state, do you think the Palestinians would accept it?
I think that's the bare minimum. It's really up to Israel. I mean, when Israel's running a ground campaign, pushing people out of their homes, pushing people out of the Palestinian state, it's there. Is there one if Biden says there is one? No, because if Netanyahu continues to move forward in the way he's been moving, he said that the Palestinian population needs to settle in neighboring countries, which means there's no Palestinian state. So Biden saying that there has to be a post-war Palestinian state while supporting Netanyahu, who said the opposite, and moreover, giving billions of dollars in military assistance for the opposite to be the end goal of Israel's operations in Palestine. It just doesn't mean much to me. But to go back to what came out of Canada recently, this leaked audio, Canada's a Western country, an ally of the United States. For there to be an elected official, or appointed official rather, discussing the politicization of saying the UNRWA has members who are in Hamas, saying that that was a political statement and was wrong. I'm really curious what evidence Canada has of this, what they know the intelligence was that the United States is relying on with this accusation. So I think we'll see what comes out of that in the coming weeks and months, because if we already have Western nations questioning this, I think we're going to see some movement on this, because to categorize a UN agency that's been supplying aid for longer than just since October 7th, that's really detrimental, especially when you have Joe Biden being, pressured or forced to make statements, or making them of his own volition, that it's really important the Palestinians get aid. You can't stop giving aid to the biggest agency with the most ground operations and ability to get necessary aid to civilians. You need the UNRWA if you're going to ensure that Palestinians don't die of famine thanks to the Israeli blockade. So the way we see this moving forward in the coming days and months, we're going to need to see Biden be more stern with Netanyahu than just supposedly giving him stern words about killing civilians behind closed doors.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. From a general principle standpoint, the whole point of the U.S. giving foreign aid should be that they're able to, in some ways, affect the policy of these other countries, right? Your foreign aid should be conditioned on the idea that those countries either operate in a certain way or meet certain conditions in order to receive it. So if Biden were smart, if he did want to actually recognize a Palestinian state, he would serve a warning to Netanyahu, perhaps, that foreign aid is no longer going to come to you, weaponry is no longer going to come to you unless you take a negotiation process seriously. So, I mean, he has a good leverage point there if he continues to provide aid in the short term while threatening to take it away in the long term. I mean, if there's any argument, I think, for continuing to give money to Israel, which I'm very skeptical of, then it would be that you still have that leverage point with Netanyahu when it comes to ending the war and heading into negotiations.
Yeah, and we have reports coming out of the White House that, President Joe Biden's upset to some degree that Netanyahu's not listening to him behind closed doors. When asked about the Rafah operation, you had John Kirby saying that, well, of course, Netanyahu and the president have talked about it. The president's warned him that this has to be an operation that takes into consideration civilian lives, which I'm sure Israel always does. They've just included them in a part of the calculation that ends up not influencing whether or not they bomb a particular school or refugee camp that they're saying is a Hamas command center. You had Mark Lamont Hill interviewing a former Mossad director that really revealed the thinking of the Israeli forces when asked if Israel would operate in the same way if it were Israeli women and children that were the civilians being killed. He wouldn't answer the question. So they've made this calculation morally that Palestinian lives are somehow worth less. And so when asked, John Kirby, are you aware of what the operation will be? How will they account for civilian lives? They just said that's up to Israel. So we're just going to keep financing them, not require them to promise us in any way or come up with an actual plan to not kill civilians while allegedly eradicating Hamas. That's a ridiculous relationship between an ally and someone who's giving them billions of dollars of aid.
Well said. We'll be back with more Rising after this.